21st, 2016. On the outskirts of Green Bay, Wisconsin, two local residents are crossing an empty field about 3 miles from the nearest residential neighborhoods when they spot the unclothed body of a young woman lying in the grass. The only clothing still on her is a pair of socks. Fastened tightly around one wrist is a pink paper wristband, the kind commonly handed out at concerts and live music events. There's no identification nearby, no documents. At the very same time, elsewhere in the city, on a quiet suburban street, a homeowner is mowing his lawn when he comes across a thick cable that appears to have been discarded. It's marked with dark brown stains. After moving it aside, he notices something else: faint traces of blood that have been washed across the concrete sidewalk. Someone had gone to great lengths to clean up the area, and it looked like they had carefully wiped off their shoes before leaving. Before we go any further, I want to explain exactly what I ran into while reviewing the case files. This investigation gives us two seemingly perfect suspects. One of them will be connected to a mountain of hard physical evidence. The other will have an undeniable motive. And this case was on the verge of falling apart because of a calculated lie. The only reason it didn't is because of two completely impartial witnesses: location tracking satellites and a fitness tracker. I'm going to show you how modern technology can destroy a seemingly airtight alibi and expose the deception behind it. So let's start building the timeline of that night. Now let's rewind about 1.5 years. Meet Nicole Vanderheiden. She's 31 years old, teaches biology, raises 3 sons and daughters, and appears to have every aspect of her life under control. In January of 2015, she meets Doug Dietrich. Not long afterward, the couple learns they're expecting a baby together, and that's when reality starts setting in. Almost overnight, Doug finds himself becoming the father of their newborn son and a parental figure to Nicole's 2 other sons and daughters. He isn't prepared for that responsibility. Arguments begin. Doug misses the freedom of his single life and continues messaging other women. Trust starts to break down. Tension builds inside the home, and that growing strain will eventually play a major role when investigators begin looking for a motive. Now let's shift our focus nearly 1,000 miles away, to Virginia. On March 1st, 2016, less than 3 months before the crime, a man named George Birch arrives in Green Bay. He gets a job as a cook and tells people he's looking for a fresh start. On the surface, he seems like a quiet, hard-working guy. But while digging through his background, I found a very dark secret. Back in 1998, Birch stood trial in connection with a fatal crime. He avoided prison only because 2 jurors were unable to reach the same conclusion as the rest of the jury, causing the case to collapse. A man with a serious criminal history is about to end up just a few feet away from Nicole. 3 separate paths are now moving toward the same destination. The evening of May 20th, Nicole and Doug decide to take a break from the problems that have been building up at home. They leave their son and daughters with a babysitter and head to a venue called Watering Hole. A rock band called Steel Panther is performing that night. As guests enter, staff members place pink paper wristbands on everyone's wrists, the very same wristbands investigators will later notice at the scene. The group spends several hours together. They relax, take photos, and enjoy the night. At exactly 11 p.m., the concert comes to an end, and the friends decide to split up. Doug unexpectedly runs into a few friends he's known since high school and stays behind with them. Nicole heads to another bar called Sardine Can with part of the group. The plan is simple. Doug will join them a little later. And this is the exact moment when a chain of events begins. One that will later be reconstructed through phone records and digital data. Have you ever thought about how precisely modern smartphones document the progression of a conflict? In this case, investigators can follow it almost minute by minute. After arriving at the second bar without her partner, Nicole's mood starts to deteriorate quickly. She pulls out her phone and begins sending Doug a stream of angry text messages. The messages contain direct accusations. She's convinced that he's spending time with another woman. At first, Doug responds calmly, refusing to engage in the argument. But the messages keep coming. Eventually, he decides to put his phone away. He stops replying to texts and ignores Nicole's calls. Then something happens that dramatically changes the situation. Doug's phone rings again. This time, the number on the screen isn't Nicole's. It belongs to one of her friends. And that call, he answers. That detail pushes Nicole over the edge. Furious, she storms out of Sardine Can. A friend named Aaron sees the condition she's in and follows her outside. He offers to drive her home, reminding her that her 6-month-old son is there. Nicole reacts immediately. She starts yelling at Aaron. Moments later, the confrontation turns physical, and she begins kicking him right there on the sidewalk. People nearby start paying attention. A few passersby slow down and watch what's happening. Aaron realizes the scene is attracting far too much attention. He decides to stop trying to help. He gets into a taxi with his friends and leaves. Nicole remains outside alone. The time is now 12:20 a.m. Doug finally arrives at Sardine Can and discovers that Nicole is no longer there. He calls her phone. The call connects. But instead of another angry exchange, all he hears is an incoherent sound coming through the speaker. The voice on the other end sounds heavily impaired, as if the person speaking has little control over their words. Doug cannot understand a single sentence. He asks her to come back to the bar. Before he gets any response, the connection suddenly drops. From that moment forward, Nicole's phone goes completely offline. The device never connects to another cellular tower again. At 2:40 a.m., Doug decides to head home. The house is completely empty. Assuming Nicole is still upset and has chosen to stay out after drinking, he locks the door and goes to bed. The next morning, at exactly 6:30 a.m., he wakes up to the sound of 6-month-old Dylan crying. Doug checks every room in the house. Nicole still hasn't come home. He starts doing what people usually do in situations like this, calling mutual acquaintances, checking with friends, trying to figure out who saw Nicole last. But no one has seen her since she walked away that night. Next, Doug calls the emergency rooms at local hospitals. He asks whether any women with injuries have been brought in, but no patient under Nicole's name is listed anywhere. And this is where a major gap appears. Doug calls emergency services and officially reports her missing only at 4:30 p.m., almost 15 hours after she disappeared. Why did he wait that long? Doug's explanation is based on their past arguments. He says he was convinced that after a heated fight, Nicole was simply sleeping it off at someone's place from the bar crowd, just to make him worry. But once the day moved into late afternoon, the empty house became impossible to ignore. 30 minutes after the call, a police cruiser pulls up to Doug's home. A female officer steps inside to ask follow-up questions. But this is not just routine paperwork. A hidden camera is attached to her uniform, and it records the entire interaction. The reason is simple. The Green Bay Police Department has already received information about the discovery made that morning in the field. The victim has not yet been identified, but the missing woman's physical description matches the unknown woman far too closely. The camera quietly captures every move Doug makes. Officers are watching his overall nervousness, checking his knuckles, neck, and face for fresh scratches or small injuries. They know the victim fought back before passing away, which means the person responsible would likely have signs of a struggle on them. At the same time, investigators begin checking Doug's property and vehicles. What forensic technicians find over the next few hours immediately turns him from a worried partner into the primary focus. They discover dark brown stains on the concrete floor of the garage. Then chemical testing reveals traces of blood in the trunk of his personal vehicle. A few more distinctive drops are found on the tile in the bathroom, but the biggest blow to Doug's alibi comes from his own shoes. On one of his boots, experts notice suspicious dark specks. They take an impression and compare the tread pattern on that boot to the print left with force on the victim's body. The geometry of the pattern is a perfect match. How often do you hear about matches that clean in forensic work? The chance of that being random is extremely small. Doug quickly realizes how this entire collection of evidence looks from the outside. He immediately shifts into full legal defense mode. He refuses to voluntarily provide a DNA sample for laboratory comparison and declines to sign consent forms for any further detailed searches of the residence. To investigators, that looks like a direct indicator of guilt and an attempt to conceal evidence. Doug is taken into custody and placed in jail on suspicion of a serious crime. At this point, the circle of seemingly undeniable physical evidence appears complete. The investigation looks finished. Case closed. Doug Dietrich spends 18 days behind bars, while forensic specialists process the evidence. Police are convinced they caught the person responsible almost immediately. And this is where the story takes a turn that few people see coming. Have you ever noticed how a series of completely unrelated coincidences can sometimes create a picture that looks perfect and still be completely wrong? One by one, the laboratory reports dismantle every part of the case. The blood found in the trunk of Doug's vehicle is human blood. But it doesn't belong to Nicole. It belongs to Nicole's young daughter. The dark stains on the garage floor turn out to be turkey blood from a recent hunting trip. The traces found on the bathroom tile came from Nicole's sister during an ordinary nosebleed. And those dark specks on the boot, the same boot whose tread pattern appeared to match the impression found on the victim's body so perfectly. They contain no biological material at all. It's ordinary dirt, just dirt from outside. But the biggest blow to the original theory comes from DNA testing. Forensic experts recover a clear DNA profile from the victim's sock and from the thick cable that had been discarded on the sidewalk. The samples are processed and compared against Doug's DNA. The result comes back with a complete exclusion, a 100% mismatch. The person who handled that cable was someone else entirely. All suspicion against Doug is immediately dropped. He is released from custody. Now, he has to return to an empty home and care for 6-month-old Dylan on his own, while Nicole's older son and daughter move in with their biological father. The investigation is back at square one. Detectives start over. They review countless hours of surveillance footage from nearby streets. They try to reconstruct Nicole's movements from the moment she left the bar to the location where she was later found. They re-interview bar employees and witnesses. Nothing. No meaningful leads emerge. The unknown DNA profile cannot be identified through local databases. It cannot be identified through federal databases either. June passes. Then, July. By August 2016, the case is in danger of becoming one more file sitting permanently in the archive of unsolved crimes. Then, without warning, an automated alert system triggers. A database algorithm finds an exact match in the national DNA system. The genetic material recovered from the cable belongs to George Birch, the same George Birch who moved from Virginia to Green Bay just 2.5 months before these events unfolded. So how did his DNA end up in law enforcement databases in the first place? The answer comes from something that happened shortly after that night. Birch was involved in a serious traffic collision. After the crash, he fled the scene. Investigators later determined that he drove the vehicle to a remote location and intentionally set it on fire in an attempt to eliminate any evidence connected to the incident. Authorities identified him quickly. He was taken into custody. A standard biological sample was collected, and his profile was entered into the system. At the time, Birch likely believed he had narrowly escaped major consequences over a destroyed vehicle. Instead, he unknowingly set the wheels of his own capture in motion. Now detectives have a name, a confirmed address, and a direct genetic connection to the evidence. Investigators move in and take George Birch into custody at his residence. Given his extensive criminal history, detectives expect resistance, hostile silence, or an immediate request for a public defender. What happens instead catches them completely off guard. Birch appears calm in the interview room, almost confident. In a steady voice, he says he knows nothing about any assault and firmly denies ever meeting Nicole. Then he does something even more surprising. As if trying to demonstrate total cooperation, he reaches into his pocket, pulls out his personal smartphone, unlocks it himself, and hands it directly to detectives. One thing I've noticed over the years is how overconfidence has a way of unraveling even the most careful plans. Birch is absolutely convinced he covered every possible trail before speaking with investigators. He deleted calls. He removed messages. He cleared his browser history. As far as he knows, there's nothing left to find. But there's one thing he doesn't understand. He has no idea how much information modern operating systems quietly collect in the background. When he originally set up a basic Google account on the device, he unknowingly granted permission for location tracking services. From that moment forward, his phone effectively became a digital beacon. Day and night, it exchanged location data with satellites and cellular networks, continuously recording his movements inside a system archive. The technical division of the Green Bay Police Department quickly downloads that data. What appears on their screens is a remarkably detailed digital map of Birch's movements during that May night. Minute by minute, location by location. And almost immediately, one detail stands out. At 1 a.m., Birch's digital trail places him at a bar located less than half a mile from the establishment, where Nicole had walked out after the argument. From 1:35 a.m. to 3:53 a.m., the marker on the police map stays fixed on one specific suburban street. That is the exact address of the home where Nicole and Doug lived. For 2.5 hours, Birch's phone is right near the place where, later that morning, a neighbor will find the discarded cable and the washed stains on the concrete. And this is where I have the same logical question you're probably asking yourself right now. Let's remember the facts. Doug got home at 2:40 a.m. The satellite data shows Birch was there from 1:35 a.m. until 3:53 a.m. That means they were physically in the same location at the same time. So how did Doug walk into his own house and not notice the offender's vehicle on that quiet street? Maybe Birch parked in the dark somewhere around the corner. Maybe Doug was too exhausted to pay attention to his surroundings. The official investigation does not give a clear answer on that detail, but the timing is hard to ignore. Then the timeline in the report suddenly speeds up. At 3:58 a.m., the location marker moves about 3 miles outside city limits. For exactly 4 minutes, the signal comes from the middle of an empty field. 3 minutes later, the system tracks movement along a highway, where Nicole's damaged phone will later be found. Investigators place the route map in front of Birch. And you can argue with people, you can twist a story, but you cannot talk your way out of coordinates. Once Birch realizes the technology has placed him at the center of the case, he has only one option left. He has to invent a new version of reality right there in the interview room. Official case records and forensic findings allow investigators to reconstruct what happened in the driveway area near the Vanderheiden home between about 1:30 a.m. and 4 a.m. George Birch followed Nicole from the entertainment district. At some point, they ended up inside a vehicle near her house. Birch expected the situation to turn intimate. But Nicole, who was still nursing her youngest son at the time, firmly refused. After that, there was a sudden outburst of aggression. The assault happened outside, near the sidewalk. Forensic experts later documented a total of 241 injuries on Nicole's body. These were not just restraint marks. They were the result of repeated, heavy, deliberate strikes. The attacker used a blunt object and severely broke her jaw. Nicole's face was injured so badly that when relatives arrived, they could not identify her visually. For the official identification, police had to request dental records from her clinic. Nicole fought back hard until the very end. That was shown by the deep bruising on her forearms and by her fingernails, which had been broken down at the base. Investigators later found particles of Birch's skin beneath them. The final act was fatal compression of the neck. The attacker used a thick cable he found at the scene. After the crime, he discarded it on the grass nearby. At one point during the assault, the attacker forcefully stepped on Nicole's chest. And this is where we finally get the answer to one of the biggest mysteries from the beginning of the investigation. The sole of Birch's shoe left a clear, deep impression on Nicole's skin. By an almost unbelievable coincidence, the tread pattern on his sneaker matched the brand and size of Doug Dietrich's footwear down to the smallest details. That single piece of evidence is what initially sent investigators down the wrong path. After that came the effort to eliminate evidence. Birch removed Nicole's clothing in an attempt to eliminate any trace of his DNA from the fabric. He then loaded her into a vehicle he had been using with permission from friends and drove toward the outskirts of town. At 3:58 a.m., his vehicle stopped at the edge of a field. Over the next 4 minutes, he carried her into the tall grass and left her there wearing only her socks. Then he returned to the highway and drove away. As he headed back toward his residence, investigators believe he threw items from the vehicle, including torn clothing, Nicole's purse, and her cell phone, hoping they would disappear along the shoulder of the roadway. He carefully cleaned the interior of the vehicle. Then he returned to his room, convinced that what happened that night would remain his secret forever. Now let's leave that reconstruction behind for a moment and go back to the brightly lit interview room where we left the suspect cornered by the evidence. By this point, George Birch understands that the satellite data has completely destroyed his original story. So he does what many suspects do when the first version falls apart. He creates a new one. Almost instantly, he presents detectives with an entirely different account. He now admits that he crossed paths with Nicole, but he desperately tries to cast himself as nothing more than an accidental witness and shift responsibility onto Doug Dietrich. According to this new version, he and Nicole met by chance at a bar. He claims she agreed to leave with him. Then, because nearby residents might have noticed them, they supposedly changed locations and parked near Nicole's house instead. Birch says they moved into the back seat of the vehicle to be alone together. Then, according to his story, everything changed. He claims Doug suddenly emerged from the darkness holding a handgun. Birch says Doug struck him in the head so hard that he immediately lost consciousness. According to Birch, when he regained consciousness on the cold pavement, Nicole was lying nearby, unresponsive. He claimed that Doug forced him, at gunpoint, to load her into the vehicle, drive far outside the city, and leave her in the field. According to this version of events, Birch later saw an opportunity on the return trip. He says he shoved Doug aside, jumped behind the wheel, and drove away, throwing Nicole's belongings along the roadside as he went. He explained his long silence with a simple argument: fear. Because of his prior convictions, he was not supposed to leave Virginia. He claimed that admitting he was in Wisconsin would have exposed him to serious legal consequences and possible imprisonment. And I have to admit something. On the surface, the story is surprisingly well constructed. In fact, it's the kind of narrative that might have sounded convincing to a jury if one critical detail had never come to light. The browsing history from George Birch's smartphone. Investigators discovered that before his arrest, he had been reading articles about the case almost every day. He collected tiny details about Nicole's life. He searched for information about her personal relationships and conflicts at home. In other words, He wasn't an accidental witness trying to explain what happened. He was taking publicly available information and carefully weaving it into a story designed to protect himself. By February 2018, the case finally reaches trial. Birch's defense team builds its strategy around that version of events. But then prosecutors introduce a piece of evidence that completely dismantles the entire story. On the night of the crime, Doug Dietrich was wearing a Fitbit fitness tracker. What the defense failed to consider was that the device continuously recorded activity levels, heart rate, and sleep patterns. The data showed that during the time frame of the crime, Doug's physiological readings were consistent with deep, uninterrupted sleep. He got up only once. The tracker recorded approximately 15 steps to the bathroom, then 15 steps back. After that, he returned to sleep. The data showed no signs of extended activity, physical exertion, or anything remotely consistent with Birch's version of events. Simply put, Doug could not have been outside waiting with a firearm. 9 days of testimony followed. Every claim was examined. Every timeline was challenged. Every piece of digital evidence was reviewed. When deliberations finally began, the jury needed less than 4 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. George Birch was found guilty of the crime. 3 months later, the judge delivered the sentence. Because Wisconsin does not have the death penalty, Birch received a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Today, he continues serving that sentence in a maximum security facility. And despite the evidence, he still insists he is innocent. But in the end, 2 electronic devices turned out to be stronger than any lie. 1 smartphone, 1 fitness tracker.
Support us by liking and subscribing. Share your theories in the comments. Until next time, stay vigilant.